There is a particular kind of comfort that comes from a story you already know. Something about the familiar, the rhythm of it, the weight of the words, the soft certainty that you know where things are going, even as they unfold, eases the mind into something quieter, slower, softer. There is no surprise to brace against. There is no tension in the not knowing. You already know. And that knowing is its own kind of rest. The way a childhood bedroom feels restful not because it is perfectly comfortable, but because it is familiar, because every detail of it has been absorbed so completely that it no longer requires your attention to process. That is what we are doing tonight. We are going to drift through the entire history of Family Guy. From the very beginning, a student film made by a kid in Connecticut with a pencil and a lot of ambition and no idea that anything he was drawing would eventually reach hundreds of millions of people, all the way through to a show that has now aired more than 460 episodes across a quarter century of American television. Every character built and broken and sometimes rebuilt. Every season of brilliance and every season of stumbling. Every resurrection, every heartbreak, every absurd slow-motion chicken fight, every long, thoughtful night in a bank vault, every scheme hatched in a crib by a tiny genius in a red bow tie. All of it, told slowly, told fully, told with the kind of care and unhurried thoroughness that only works when the lights are low and the world outside has gone quiet. So, get comfortable. Let the blankets settle around you. Let your breathing slow. Let the room go quiet and the screen go dim, and let the story of the Griffin family begin exactly where it began. Not in their fictional Rhode Island hometown, but in a classroom in Rhode Island, where a young man with a pencil and a vision was about to draw something that would not let go of him for the rest of his life. Part 1. The Boy from Connecticut: How It All Started. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October 1973 in the small town of Kent, Connecticut. He was the kind of child who drew cartoons before he could write full sentences, the kind of kid whose imagination lived just slightly outside the world everyone else occupied. By the time he was 8 years old, he was already publishing a comic strip called Walter Crouton in his local newspaper. This was not a phase. This was not a hobby. From the very beginning, this was simply what Seth MacFarlane did. He told stories with pictures. He made people laugh with lines on paper. He attended high school at the Kent School in Connecticut. And then, following the direction that had always felt most natural, he enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, a place known for serious artistic training, for the kind of education that took creativity and forced it through rigor until something precise and disciplined came out the other side. MacFarlane studied animation there, and he was extraordinary at it. Not just technically, he had always had the technical instincts, but in terms of voice and sensibility. The characters he drew had personality before they ever moved. There was something in them that felt alive even on the page. During his time at RISD, MacFarlane worked on something that would quietly change the course of American television. As his senior thesis film, he created a short animated piece called The Life of Larry. It was completed in 1995 and ran for about 11 minutes. The film centered on a slovenly, overweight, middle-aged man named Larry Cummings, who lived with his wife Lois and his son Milt. Larry was not particularly smart. He was not particularly ambitious. He was the kind of man who moved through life on instinct and comfort, and a kind of cheerful obliviousness that made him somehow endearing despite being entirely unremarkable. And Larry had a dog, a talking dog named Steve, who was intellectually curious, well-spoken, and possessed of a dry awareness of his surroundings that stood in sharp contrast to Larry's blundering. If those two names, Larry and Steve, feel like echoes of something you know very well, that is because they are. Larry would become Peter Griffin, Steve would become Brian. The DNA was already fully formed. A professor at RISD recognized what he was looking at and submitted MacFarlane's thesis film to Hanna-Barbera Productions, the legendary animation studio that had given the world the Flintstones and Scooby-Doo and so many other pieces of animated history. The head of development at Hanna-Barbera, a woman named Ellen Cockrell, attended a senior screening at RISD and met MacFarlane. She offered him a position, and just like that, the young man from Kent, Connecticut, had his first professional job in animation. At Hanna-Barbera, MacFarlane worked on some of the Cartoon Network shows that defined the animated landscape of the mid to late 1990s. He wrote for Johnny Bravo, for Cow and Chicken, for Dexter's Laboratory. These were not simple assignments. Dexter's Laboratory in particular was a sharp, well-crafted cartoon with a specific comedic sensibility, the comedy of contrast, the comedy of a brilliant mind trapped in mundane circumstances, and that sensibility was one McFarlane absorbed and eventually made his own. He also worked briefly as a writer for Disney Channel's Jungle Cubs, expanding his range across the studio system. He was learning. He was building. In 1996, while still at Hanna-Barbera, McFarlane created a follow-up to his thesis film. He called it Larry and Steve, and it was broadcast as part of Cartoon Network's What a Cartoon programming block in 1997. This short was a refinement. Larry and Steve were sharper now, funnier, better defined. The gap between them, Larry's chaotic impulsiveness and Steve's weary intelligence, was clearer and more comedically charged. Anyone watching it could see the potential, and Fox Broadcasting Company executives saw it. In early 1998, Fox approached McFarlane and asked him to develop the Larry and Steve concept into a full television series. They offered him a budget of somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000. Accounts vary slightly, and asked him to produce a 15-minute pilot presentation. McFarlane went home, sat down, and over the next several months produced an animated pilot almost entirely by himself. He created it at home, doing a staggering amount of the work alone: the animation, the writing, the music, and virtually all of the voice acting. He could do multiple distinct voices, and he leaned into that ability fully. The result was a 15-minute pilot that introduced the Griffin family, a name now chosen instead of Cummings, living in a fictional Rhode Island town. He pitched it to Fox executives Gary Newman and Dana Walden in May 1998. They liked what they saw. They greenlit the series. And Seth MacFarlane, at 24 years old, had just become the creator of what would eventually become one of the most watched animated series in television history. Production ramped up quickly. McFarlane assembled a writing staff that included people who would help shape the show's earliest and most beloved seasons writers, like Chris Sheridan and David Zuckerman, who served as co-showrunner, along with Danny Smith, Gary Janetti, Neil Goldman, Garrett Donovan, and Mike Barker. These were people who understood what McFarlane was going for, a show that felt like a modern version of a classic family sitcom, but with a humor style that was fast, unpredictable, and constantly aware of its own absurdity. The show that was taking shape was genuinely new. It looked a little like The Simpsons at a glance: animated family, American suburb, dysfunctional household. But the comedic approach was entirely different. Where The Simpsons found its humor in character and situation and heart, Family Guy was building a machine that ran on speed, association, digression, and a particular willingness to leap sideways at any moment and show you something completely unexpected. The characters settled into their forms during production. Peter Griffin became the lovable buffoon at the center, physically imposing, intellectually limited, but genuinely, warmly devoted to his family in the way that only people who cannot articulate their feelings ever truly are. He was modeled partly on a security guard McFarlane had known, a man of enormous physical size and an equally enormous capacity for accidental chaos. Lois Griffin became the anchor, a woman of class and patience and real intelligence. Formerly Lois Pewterschmidt, daughter of one of Rhode Island's old money families, who had married down and did not regret it even on the days she had every right to. Their children took shape. Meg, the teenage daughter trying to find her place in a family that was simply too overwhelming for any ordinary person to navigate comfortably. Chris, the gentle, slow-witted son who shared his father's physical bulk and his father's cheerful obliviousness. And Stewie the baby, the 1-year-old who spoke in the clipped, authoritative tones of a British military officer, who built weapons and harbored elaborate world domination schemes in his yellow onesie and red bow tie, who regarded his mother as his primary obstacle and his elimination of her as his life's central purpose. And Stewie, 1-year-old in a yellow onesie with a red bow tie, who spoke in complete sophisticated sentences about his plans to take over the planet or end his mother's life. The genius of the original Stewie concept was the contrast, the gap between what he looked like and what he was doing and saying. Here was this round-headed baby sitting in a high chair being fed strained peas, and he was talking about the specific engineering challenges involved in constructing a weather control device. The humor came from the gap, from the complete, committed, absolutely serious way in which Stewie pursued his ambitions, regardless of how absurd the surrounding context made those ambitions look. He was never in on the joke. He was the joke not because he was ridiculous, but because the world around him was unable to perceive what he actually was. The detail that almost nobody could understand what Stewie was saying, that the adults in the show heard babbling where the audience heard eloquence, added a layer of comedy that the show used with great consistency in those early seasons. Stewie would deliver a lengthy, carefully structured monologue about his latest scheme, and Lois would look at him and say something about what a happy baby he was today, and Stewie would look at the audience with an expression of aristocratic disdain so complete it was almost painful. The dramatic irony was the whole engine of the comedy in those scenes, and it worked because the writers understood that the only thing funnier than a supervillain is a supervillain that nobody takes seriously. And then Brian, the dog, the talking family dog who walked on his hind legs, drove the family car, drank dry martinis, had literary aspirations, and was, by every measure, the most emotionally and intellectually grounded member of the household. Brian was Steve, fully evolved. Steve had always been sharp and aware, but Brian was given an interiority that made him feel genuinely human, flawed and insecure and loyal, in the way that people who quietly care about things they cannot always express tend to be. Seth MacFarlane voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, four of the show's central characters, while also handling various recurring and background voices. He had a facility for distinct vocal characterizations that was, from the very beginning, extraordinary. Peter's voice is nasal and slightly strangled, the voice of a man who has opinions about everything and the volume to impose them on any room he enters. Brian's voice is smooth and measured, low and deliberate, the voice of someone attempting to maintain dignity in circumstances that do not easily accommodate dignity. Stewie's voice is plummy and over-enunciated, every vowel attended to as if pronunciation itself were a form of aristocratic authority, the voice of a man trapped in a baby's body who has never for a single moment accepted that his physical limitations define his possibilities. And Quagmire's voice is fast, a rapid-fire drawl that implies someone always slightly ahead of the consequences of his most recent decision. Four completely distinct people living in one man's voice box, summoned on demand, instantly recognizable to anyone who has spent any time with the show. MacFarlane could move between them seamlessly in recording sessions, giving each one a specific quality of presence that went beyond the script, an attitude toward the world that existed in the sound of them before a single written word had been spoken. The supporting cast assembled around him was equally strong. Alex Borstein voiced Lois, giving the character a warmth and a particular quality of exhausted love that made her feel completely real. A woman who was smarter than everyone around her and had chosen, deliberately, to stay with the most chaotic of them. Seth Green took on Chris with a gentle precision, finding the character's sweet obliviousness without ever making it cruel or mean. Lacey Chabert voiced Meg in the first season with a quiet, anxious earnestness that was exactly right for a girl who wanted nothing more than to be seen and was consistently failing to be seen. The first episode, titled Death Has a Shadow, was scheduled to air on the 31st of January 1999, immediately following Super Bowl XXIII. If you understand how television works, you understand what that means. The Super Bowl is the single most watched broadcast in American television every year. Tens of millions of people sit in front of their screens for hours, and then when it ends, they are still there, warm and comfortable and not quite ready to move. Airing a new show in that window is like being introduced at the most crowded party of the year. You are guaranteed an audience. The question is always whether you can hold them. Family Guy held them. The first episode drew approximately 22 million viewers. For a brand new animated comedy for any new show, really that was an extraordinary number. The Griffins had arrived. Seth MacFarlane's strange, fast, funny, surprisingly warm vision of an American family had landed in American living rooms, and a significant portion of those living rooms liked what they saw. The show settled into its regular schedule beginning in April 1999, running 7 episodes through its first season. Those 7 episodes introduced not just the main family but the constellation of neighbors and friends and recurring figures that would populate the Griffins' neighborhood for the next quarter century. Joe Swanson, the wheelchair-using police officer next door, who was introduced in Season 1's A Hero Sits Next Door as the physically capable, admired new neighbor that Peter envied. Glenn Quagmire, the airline pilot with the aggressive social life, and the catchphrase that became one of the most quoted pieces of dialogue in the show's history. Cleveland Brown, the soft-spoken, gentle friend whose calm demeanor and steady loyalty made him a natural counterbalance to Peter's volatility. Dr. Hartman, the perpetually incompetent physician. Tom Tucker, the local news anchor with the sweep of hair that defied weather conditions. Mayor Adam West, playing a version of himself as the eccentric, oblivious mayor of their town. These were the people. This was the world. And for the first season, it was enough to simply let it breathe and find itself. The humor in those early episodes was already distinctive. The cutaway gags were there from the very first episode. A character would make a reference, and the show would snap away to a brief visual illustration of that reference before snapping back. These moments were short. They were tight. They worked like jokes within jokes, little bonus punchlines layered on top of whatever the main story was doing. In those early episodes, they were the seasoning, not the meal. The meal was the story of the Griffins, of Peter getting into trouble and getting himself back out, of Lois trying to hold the household together with a kind of patient love that was never naive, of the kids navigating adolescence and absurdity in equal measure, of Brian drinking his martini and watching everything with the quiet amusement of someone who has long since accepted that the world does not make sense and has decided to enjoy it anyway. The first season ranked 33rd in the Nielsen ratings, averaging 12.8 million households tuning in. For a new show in its first partial season, only 7 episodes, that was solid, encouraging, genuinely real. The audience was there. The world was watching. And Seth MacFarlane, still in his mid-20s, still the kid from Kent, Connecticut who had published his first comic strip at 8 and drawn his thesis film mostly by himself at 21, had built something that was already unmistakably, irreducibly itself. What he had built was not a perfect object. The first season had moments that were still finding their footing, jokes that did not land as cleanly as the show would later learn to land them, character dynamics that were still being calibrated. But the essential thing, the thing that would make the show survive cancellation twice and come back stronger and persist for 30 years was already present. You could feel it in the rhythm of the scenes, in the warmth underneath the chaos, in the specific quality of the relationship between Peter and Lois, in the way Brian watched the world from the corner of every room with the patient, fond amusement of someone who has decided that people are worth loving even when they are being completely absurd. Family Guy had arrived. What happened next would test it in ways that nobody, not MacFarlane, not the network, not the audience could have anticipated. But television, as MacFarlane would soon learn, does not always reward what it creates. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are in the world and what time it is. I love seeing where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this, hit subscribe. It's the easiest way to support this channel, and I genuinely appreciate every single one of you. Part 2. The Golden Years Seasons 1 through 3. There is a particular quality to the early seasons of Family Guy that is very hard to articulate and very easy to feel. You know it when you watch those episodes. There is a lightness to them, not an absence of darkness, because the show was always willing to go dark, but a lightness of spirit, a sense that the people making it were genuinely enjoying themselves, that the jokes were being written by people who loved the characters they were writing for. The early Griffins were a family you wanted to spend time with. Even at their most chaotic, even at their most ridiculous, they were people recognizable, warm, fundamentally human under all the cartoon exaggeration. Peter Griffin, in those first 3 seasons, was a specific kind of man that audiences recognized. He was big. He was not clever. He had no filter between his impulses and his actions, which meant he was constantly in the middle of something he had not fully thought through. But, and this was the essential thing, he loved his family. He loved Lois with an ardor that was simple and complete and never in question, even when his execution of that love was spectacular in its incompetence. He loved his kids in the way that men who struggled to express emotion often love the people they would do anything for. Not always showing up the right way, but always showing up. When an episode ended and Peter had made a mess of things, he would recognize it. He would apologize. He would sit across from Lois and say something clumsy but genuine, and she would take his hand, and the episode would close on something that felt true. That mattered. That is the thing that is easy to miss when you think of early Family Guy as simply a fast, edgy comedy. It had a heart, a real one, and the humor was better for it, because the comedy of a lovable man doing foolish things lands differently than the comedy of a cruel man doing cruel things. When Peter accidentally destroys something precious to Lois, or loses the family's savings on a get-rich-quick scheme, you laugh because you recognize the gap between his intentions and his outcomes. You laugh with him, even at him, because underneath the chaos he is trying. Early Peter was always trying. Season 1 built the world. The 7 episodes introduced the family, the neighborhood, the show's rhythms and rules. They were 7 episodes of discovery, both for the audience and for the show itself. You could feel it finding its footing, the writers learning what worked and what did not, the voice cast settling into their characters with increasing naturalness and ease. By the time the season ended with Mind Over Murder, the episode where Peter builds a bar in his basement and Stewie, after being subjected to the tedium of a youth soccer game, writes an original song that he performs at a piano, there was already the clear sense that this show had a particular genius that was all its own. Season 2, which ran from September 1999 to July 2000, was 20 episodes and represented a significant deepening of everything the first season had established. The show grew more confident in its darkness. It began to reach further into its own absurdity, without losing the emotional core that made the absurdity land. Death is a Bitch saw Death himself become a recurring guest character after Peter accidentally avoided dying, and Death twisted his ankle on the Griffin porch, an episode that played with mortality in a way that was simultaneously ridiculous and surprisingly affecting. Brian in Love gave the family dog a bottle episode of his own, an exploration of his unrequited feelings for Lois, his emotional confusion, his drinking, his loneliness. It was a Brian episode that treated the character with genuine care, and it worked beautifully. Season 2 was also the season that confirmed Stewie Griffin as one of the most original characters in animation. Every episode found new angles on the evil genius baby concept, new schemes, new weapons, new monologues delivered with plummy theatrical menace while Lois fed him strained peas. In A Mission Impossible, Stewie discovers that Lois might be pregnant again and immediately declares war on the potential sibling, shrinking himself down and entering Peter's body in a sequence that was surreal even by the show's standards. In 15 Minutes of Shame, the family briefly becomes the subjects of a reality television show, and Stewie's interviews with the producers become the episode's comedic highlight, the baby speaking directly to camera in perfect documentary confessional mode while his family implodes around him. He was dangerous, unpredictable, endlessly creative, and the writers at this point still seem to have an inexhaustible supply of new material to mine from the concept of an evil, eloquent, world-dominating infant. The animation in these first 2 seasons had a specific quality worth noting. It was done primarily by Rough Draft Studios for Season 2, and the work had an energy and expressiveness that matched the show's humor. The characters moved with a looseness, a scrappy vitality that made even the strangest moments feel grounded. When Peter fell, he fell with weight. When Stewie raged, his tiny face twisted with a theatricality that was specific and precise. The animation was not always technically perfect. There were moments of roughness, of inconsistency, but it was alive in a way that mattered. By the time Season 3 arrived, Family Guy had settled into something genuinely wonderful. The show had found its voice entirely. The writing was sharp. The characters were fully realized. The balance between comedy and heart was exquisitely maintained. Season 3 ran from July 2001, and it produced some of the most beloved episodes in the show's history. Road to Europe gave the world the first installment of what would become one of the show's signature formats, the Road 2 episode, in which Brian and Stewie are thrown together on some adventure and spend the runtime moving through comedy and tension and genuine emotional exchange. In this first entry, Stewie becomes obsessed with a British children's television show called Jolly Farm Review and determines to travel to England to find it. Brian is dragged along, and the two of them end up bumbling across Europe in a misadventure that was warm and funny and gave early voice to the chemistry between the characters. The chemistry was real. Even at this stage, watching Brian and Stewie together felt like watching two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, even as they drove each other to distraction. Screwed the Pooch explored Brian's romantic life in ways that were both funny and surprisingly touching, finding genuine comedy and genuine pathos in the situation of a dog attempting to pursue a relationship with a purebred racing greyhound, while her owner, Carter Pewterschmidt, grew increasingly enraged by the entire situation. Carter was established clearly in this episode as one of the show's best recurring antagonists, a man of old money and inherited power, whose contempt for anyone he considered beneath him was barely concealed and completely specific. His hostility toward Brian was funny because it was so disproportionate, and also because it was so clearly about something larger than Brian, about Peter, about Lois's choice, about everything in his daughter's life that he would have arranged differently if anyone had let him. Brian Wallows and Peter's Swallows, in which Brian falls in love with a bitter, reclusive old woman played with remarkable tenderness, and the two of them share a connection that ends in her death, was one of the most emotionally affecting episodes the show produced in any season. It won Seth MacFarlane a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Music and Lyrics for the original song in the episode, You and I Are So Awfully Different, an animated comedy show winning an Emmy for a song about love and loneliness between a talking dog and a dying woman that was Family Guy at its best. Strange, funny, and somehow breaking your heart a little while you laughed. The relationship between Peter and his friends at the Drunken Clam in these seasons deserves attention. Those scenes, Peter and Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland gathered around a table with their drinks, talking about their lives and their problems and whatever had gone wrong that week, had an ease and a warmth that made them feel genuinely lived in. These were friends. Not caricatures of friendship, not stand-ins for jokes, but people who liked each other, who showed up for each other, who had the kind of easy shorthand that accumulates between people who have spent a lot of time in the same room. Peter's friendships were one of the elements of the early show that grounded him most effectively. He was the bumbling center of a real social world, and that made the chaos he created feel consequential in a way that mattered. Meg in these seasons was ordinary in the way that ordinary people are ordinary. She was the girl at the edge of her family's extravagance, the teenager who wanted to be noticed and mostly was not, who tried too hard with her peers and not hard enough with herself. She was not mistreated. She was simply overlooked, and there is a real and recognizable sadness in that, the sadness of being the least remarkable person in a remarkable household. The show played it with a lightness in these seasons, finding the comedy in her failed attempts at social acceptance without ever making her the target of anything truly cruel. Chris was the sweet one, the gentle, round-faced boy who shared his father's basic good nature and his father's basic inability to navigate the world with any efficiency. He was strange in small, specific ways. He had imaginary enemies and odd obsessions, and a pure-heartedness that made it impossible not to feel warmly toward him, but he was never threatening or malicious. He was simply a child with a child's straightforwardness and a child's occasional capacity for saying exactly the true thing at the worst possible moment. And the town itself was a character in its own right in these seasons. This fictional Rhode Island city felt specific. It had a geography that the writers used consistently. The Drunken Clam on one corner of the neighborhood, the Griffin House on Spooner Street, James Woods Regional High School where Meg endured her adolescence, the happy-go-lucky toy factory where Peter worked before being laid off, and eventually the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery that became his longer-term workplace. The town had a sense of place, a sense of reality, that grounded the surrealism in something you could almost believe in. The cutaway gags in these seasons deserve a specific and careful appreciation because they were not what they would later become. In these first 3 seasons, the cutaway was a tool used with restraint and precision. A character would make a casual comparison or a passing reference, "This is like the time I tried to," and the show would cut away to illustrate it. The cutaway would last 10 seconds, sometimes 15, almost never more than 30. It would deliver its joke and exit before the audience had time to lose the thread of the main story. The main story was always still there, complete and functional and carrying its own weight. You could have watched any of these episodes with the cutaways removed and had a complete, well-constructed piece of television. The cutaways were additions. They were not the load-bearing walls. This distinction mattered enormously. The early cutaways worked because they were unexpected rather than anticipated. When the show cut away to something, you did not know what you were going to see. The surprise was part of the joke. As the seasons went on and the format became more dominant and more central, the cutaways began to feel less like surprises and more like scheduled departures. You knew they were coming. You knew they would last a certain length of time, and the knowing reduced the impact. In seasons 1 through 3, you did not know. The show could still catch you off guard. The heart of the early show, and this is the quality that is hardest to replicate and most clearly absent from the later seasons, was the Griffin family's love for each other. Not a perfect love, not an uncomplicated love, but a real one. Episodes ended with Peter and Lois in each other's arms, with Peter sitting down and saying, in his clumsy, specific way, that he had been wrong and that he was sorry. With the family gathered around the table or the television, annoying each other in the way that people who love each other always annoy each other, which is to say deeply and without real malice. The chaos was always contained within that love. The chaos never swallowed it. These 3 seasons, all 29 episodes of them, If you count the unaired 22nd episode of Season 3 that eventually premiered on Adult Swim, represent the foundation of everything Family Guy became. They are the standard by which every subsequent decision would be measured. Not because they were perfect. There were weak episodes scattered through them, jokes that did not land, moments that felt half-formed, character details that were established and then forgotten. But as a body of work, they cohered into something that had genuine artistic identity. Family Guy was not trying to be anything other than what it was. It was not chasing The Simpsons or trying to compete with South Park. It was entirely itself, fast and irreverent, and unexpectedly moving and occasionally brilliant, and that self-possession was what made it special. What happened next was not the show's fault, but it would define the show's destiny in ways that nobody could have predicted. Part 3. Death and Resurrection. The cancellations and the miracle. Every story worth telling has a moment when everything goes wrong. For Family Guy, that moment came not because the show stopped being good, but because the network that owned it stopped believing in it. And the story of what happened between 2000 and 2005 is one of the stranger chapters in the history of American television. A story about a show that was killed twice and came back stronger than before, driven back to life by something that had never saved a television show before. The trouble started in Season 2. Fox, looking at its scheduling needs, decided to move Family Guy from its original Sunday night slot to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening. This placed the show directly opposite Frasier on NBC, one of the most acclaimed and consistently watched comedies of the era. Frasier was in the middle of its long, successful run. It had a loyal, established audience. Family Guy was still new, still building its following, and it did not have the strength to compete in that time slot. The ratings fell. Fox shuffled the show again, moving it to Tuesday nights, where it found itself competing against Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, the quiz show that was at the peak of its cultural moment and drawing enormous audiences. The ratings fell further. Fox kept moving the show around the schedule without giving it time to find a stable audience, without the promotional support that might have helped, without the patience that a genuinely good new show sometimes requires. They were doing what networks sometimes do, treating a show as a product to be optimized for immediate return rather than a property worth nurturing over time. Season 3 premiered in July 2001 with another punishing time slot Thursdays at 8 in the evening, which put it directly against Friends. Not merely the most popular show on NBC at the time, but arguably the most popular show on American television, drawing somewhere in the neighborhood of 25 million viewers per week at the height of its popularity. And then, that same fall, CBS launched Survivor as a genuine cultural phenomenon, pulling enormous numbers against everything on every other network. Family Guy, competing against two of the biggest television events of the season, never had a chance to breathe. In 2002, Fox canceled Family Guy for the second time. 28 episodes had aired. One episode from Season 3, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, never aired at all during the original run, pulled for content that the network found too potentially controversial. The show's run appeared to be over. MacFarlane moved on. The writers moved on. The voice cast found other work. The Griffins went dark, but something was happening quietly in the background. Something that nobody predicted and that would change the rules of television in ways that are still felt today. Fox had produced 3 seasons of Family Guy, and when the show was canceled, those episodes had value as library content material that could be licensed to other networks for rebroadcast. Fox tried to sell the syndication rights to the show and found that nobody was particularly interested. The show had been canceled twice with low ratings. Its commercial value was unclear. Eventually, Cartoon Network acquired the rights to air Family Guy reruns on their Adult Swim late-night programming block at a cost that, by all accounts, was remarkably low. Nobody expected much. Adult Swim launched Family Guy reruns on the 20th of April 2003. And within weeks, something extraordinary happened. The show became the most watched program on the entire Adult Swim block. It was not close. Family Guy was dominating late-night cable, averaging around 1.9 million viewers per night, a number that was extraordinary for that time slot on that network. It was boosting Adult Swim's overall viewership by an estimated 239%. An audience that had never found the show during its network run, or that had discovered it and lost track of it during the scheduling chaos, was now finding it reliably at the same time every night and falling in love with it. At the same time, almost exactly at the same time, the DVD sets for Family Guy's first and second seasons hit store shelves. This was 2003. Home video was still a significant part of how people engaged with television content they cared about. The idea of binge watching did not exist yet in any meaningful sense, because streaming did not exist yet, and the only way to watch a show on your own schedule was to buy or rent physical discs. Family Guy's first season DVD sold over 400,000 copies within a single month of release. Within a year, total DVD sales had reached over 2 million copies, making it the best-selling television DVD of 2003 and the second best-selling television DVD set ever released at that point, trailing only the first season of Chappelle's Show. The third season DVD would go on to sell more than 1 million copies as well. Think about what was happening. A canceled show was becoming a phenomenon. People who had never seen it were discovering it through late-night reruns and buying the DVD sets to own it. People who had loved it during its original run were finding it again on Adult Swim and feeling the rekindling of something they thought had been taken from them. The word of mouth was enormous. The internet, still in its early social form, still primarily forums and fan sites and early blogging communities, was full of people talking about Family Guy, recommending it, evangelizing for it. Think about what was happening more carefully, because it was not just unusual, it was unprecedented in a way that reshuffled the industry's assumptions about what a television audience was and how it worked. The Nielsen rating system, which had been the primary instrument of measuring television success since the 1950s, worked by tracking what people watched when they watched it on the network. It measured first-run broadcast viewership. It did not measure people watching old episodes on late-night cable 3 years after cancellation. It did not measure people buying DVD box sets and watching shows in their own time on their own schedules. The audience that was making Family Guy a phenomenon in 2003 and 2004 was an audience that the industry's existing measurement systems could barely see. This was not an isolated problem. It was a structural one. The same audience was out there for other shows that had been canceled with similar low broadcast ratings and that might have had similar post-cancellation popularity if they had been given the same late-night cable platform. Family Guy was simply the most visible example because the numbers were so striking. A show canceled for low ratings was, a year later, the most-watched program on Adult Swim. That kind of reversal did not fit the narrative that the industry told itself about cancellation and failure. Fox noticed. Of course they noticed. The network that had canceled Family Guy twice was watching it become a phenomenon on cable and a bestseller on home video, and the math was clear. In May 2004, Fox announced it was ordering 35 new episodes of Family Guy. The show was coming back. The announcement was accompanied by the kind of institutional excitement that networks produce when they have discovered something they wish they had not let go. A combination of genuine enthusiasm and implicit acknowledgement that they had made a mistake. This was the first time in television history that a canceled show had been revived primarily based on DVD sales and cable ratings, rather than any conventional measure of first-run broadcast success. Seth MacFarlane later noted the strange quality of this. The same network that had canceled the show twice, that had scheduled it in ways designed to let it fail, was now bringing it back and claiming credit for the audience enthusiasm that had been generated entirely without their help. The fans had saved the show. Fox had simply been paying attention when the fans' work became commercially undeniable. The deal Fox had offered MacFarlane for the revival was reportedly among the most lucrative in animated television history at that point, a reflection both of how badly the network wanted the show back and of how significantly MacFarlane's negotiating position had improved between the second, cancellation, and the revival offer. He was no longer the 24-year-old animator who had pitched a 15-minute pilot. He was the creator of a phenomenon, the person whose vision had generated millions of DVD sales and dominated Adult Swim's late-night ratings without any network support whatsoever. The power in the relationship had shifted significantly, and the deal reflected that. Family Guy did not just come back from cancellation. It changed what cancellation means, permanently and significantly. After Family Guy, television executives had to consider that a show canceled for low first-run ratings might have an audience that the existing metrics were failing to count: people watching late at night on cable, people buying physical media, people showing up in ways that Nielsen could not easily capture. The industry began to think differently about these things. It had to. The return was announced for a fourth season beginning in 2005. Fans who had thought they had lost the show forever were getting it back. Seth MacFarlane and the writing team substantially restaffed, since 3 years had scattered the original writers to other projects, began production on new episodes. The voice cast returned. The animation studios ramped back up. And on the 1st of May 2005, Family Guy aired its first new episode since February 2002. The episode was called North by North, a title that riffed on Hitchcock, and it opened with the Griffins in their living room, Peter addressing the audience directly, acknowledging the 3-year gap with the kind of self-aware joke that the show had always been capable of. It seems today that all you see is violence in movies and sex on TV, but where are those good old-fashioned values on which we used to rely? And then the opening theme, unchanged, rolled out with that particular piano intro that had become embedded in the cultural consciousness of millions of viewers. The revival drew strong ratings. People had showed up. The audience that had saved the show through DVD purchases and late-night viewing came back to watch new episodes, and they brought people with them, people who had discovered the show through Adult Swim and had never seen the original 3 seasons, people who had been too young for the original run and were now old enough, people for whom Family Guy was already something they had watched 100 times in clips and were finally seeing in full episode form. The premiere drew somewhere around 11.6 million viewers, not the Super Bowl-inflated 22 million of the original debut, but extraordinary for a returning show, and proof that the audience built through unconventional means was absolutely real. Family Guy had returned from the dead, and for a moment, just a moment, everything felt like it was exactly where it was supposed to be. The characters were back. The voices were back. The drunken clam was open, and Peter and his friends were gathered around the table, and Lois was somewhere being patient, and Brian was nursing his drink, and Stewie was in his room building something dangerous, and Meg was trying to be noticed and mostly not being noticed, and the whole world of the Griffins was back on the air. But the show that came back in 2005 was not quite the same show that had gone away in 2002. It could not be. 3 years changes things. 3 years changes people. A writing staff that has been almost entirely rebuilt brings new sensibilities and new preferences and new ideas about what the show should be and what it should feel like. Some of those new ideas were good, some were excellent, and some would, over time, reveal themselves to be the early forms of problems that would not become fully visible until they had accumulated for several more seasons. Part 4. The return seasons 4 and 5 and the first shifts. The 4th season of Family Guy arrived into a different landscape than the one the show had originally inhabited. YouTube launched in 2005. The same year Family Guy came back, and the combination of those two events would shape the show's identity and its relationship to its audience in ways that nobody could have fully predicted at the time. The internet was becoming a place where short clips of television could be shared, watched, passed around, discussed, and made into something much larger than a single episode ever could be. And Family Guy was perfectly designed to become an internet phenomenon. The cutaway gag, always the show's most distinctive formal device, was, structurally, the perfect internet object. A self-contained 30-second to 60-second scene with a clear setup and punchline, disconnected from the larger context of its episode, equally funny or not whether you had seen the episode or not. You could clip it, upload it, share it. You could watch it 10 times. You could send it to a friend with the implicit message, "This is what this show is, and this is why you should watch it." The early internet was already beginning to do this with Family Guy content during the Adult Swim years, and the return of new episodes in 2005 accelerated everything. Season 4 ran from May 2005 to May 2006, consisting of 30 episodes, the longest season the show had produced. Fox placed it in the Sunday night animation domination block, alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a new MacFarlane creation called American Dad, which had premiered just a few months earlier in February 2005. This was the most prominent possible position on the network's schedule. Family Guy was the star of the most watched animated night in American television. And Season 4 was, in many ways, very good. The writing was sharp enough to produce some of the episodes that are still considered among the series' best. The road to episodes continued, deepening the Brian and Stewie dynamic in ways that felt genuinely inventive. The Stewie kills Lois foreshadowing was building. The humor was fast and frequently brilliant. There were moments in Season 4 that matched the best of the original run. Season 4 also demonstrated Family Guy's extraordinary facility for parody, one of the show's most consistent and most successful comedic modes across all 24 seasons. The show's willingness to engage directly with other pieces of film and television, to reconstruct and comment on cultural touchstones through the specific lens of the Griffins and their fictional Rhode Island world, was always one of its most distinctive qualities. The episode PTV in Season 4, in which Peter creates his own television network to escape the FCC's increasingly aggressive censorship regime, worked partly as satire of broadcast regulation and partly as a showcase for the show's ability to parody the conventions of different television genres simultaneously. Later seasons would produce increasingly elaborate parody episodes, full-length recreations of specific films, systematic deconstructions of specific genre conventions that demonstrated the writers' encyclopedic knowledge of film and television history, and their ability to use that knowledge for genuine comedic purpose. But the shifts were beginning. They were small in Season 4, small enough that you could almost miss them episode to episode, but they were there. Peter's stupidity was being pushed slightly further than it had been. In the original seasons, Peter made bad decisions because he did not think things through, because his impulse control was essentially non-existent, because he was a man of strong feelings and weak reasoning. That was still mostly true in Season 4, but the writers, working under new pressures and with new instincts, occasionally pushed him past that line into something sharper moments where he did something that was not just foolish but actively unkind, and where the show did not entirely hold him accountable for it the way the earlier seasons would have. Brian's politics were growing louder. In the original 3 seasons, Brian's liberal views were one part of a character that had many parts. He was a failed writer, a drinker, a romantic, a loyal friend, a wry observer. His politics were there, but they did not dominate. In Season 4 and into Season 5, they began to take up more room. There were scenes where Brian would deliver a speech about some political or social issue that felt less like character expression and more like the writers using him as a direct channel. Even viewers who agreed with Brian's positions sometimes found these moments grating, because the character was becoming a vehicle for views rather than a person who happened to hold them. Stewie's transformation was the most dramatic and the most deliberate of the changes in these seasons, and it is the one that fans of the original show most consistently pointed to as a loss rather than an evolution. In Seasons 1 through 3, Stewie's evil genius identity had been his entire personality, his defining feature, the axis around which everything else about him turned. By Season 4, the writers had made a conscious decision that the evil baby concept had been taken as far as they felt it could go. They believed they had explored the concept's range and could not find new material in it. The world domination plots grew less frequent. The attempts on Lois's life slowed and then nearly stopped. Stewie began to show more emotional interiority, more vulnerability, more interest in his relationship with Brian. He became softer, more complex, more openly human in his insecurities and his needs. The argument the writers made for this change, that the concept was exhausted, that the joke had run its course, was challenged by everything that followed. If there was not enough material in the original Stewie concept to sustain many more seasons, why did the show manage to produce 20-plus seasons with a replacement version? The answer, which many fans found themselves arriving at over time, was that what was exhausted was not the concept but the writer's interest in exploring it. Those are different things. The original evil genius baby had untapped potential that the show chose not to develop. And the Stewie who took his place, more accessible, more emotional, better suited to the buddy adventure format that the show was increasingly relying on, was a replacement rather than an evolution in the truest sense. Season 4 also introduced what would become an increasingly important format, the Road to episode, which became something more than just a recurring type of story. Road to Rupert, which aired in Season 5, became one of the most beloved episodes the show produced in its post-revival years. The premise, Stewie's beloved teddy bear Rupert is accidentally sold at a garage sale and ends up in Aspen, Colorado, requiring a cross-country journey to retrieve him, was simple and warm and funny. And the episode executed it with a tenderness that showed the Brian and Stewie dynamic at its most effective. The joy of watching these two wildly mismatched characters, the cynical, world-weary dog and the tiny, imperious, unexpectedly sensitive baby, navigate the world together, had a quality that was genuinely special. Season 4 also introduced more explicitly the dimension of Stewie's character that would become dominant in later seasons, his emotional relationship with Brian. The dynamic between them had always been present. Brian was one of the few characters who could understand Stewie and speak with him directly, which created an intimacy between them that no other relationship on the show had. But in the original 3 seasons, their interactions were primarily comedic. Brian as the reluctant confidant of the scheming baby. Brian as the weary witness to Stewie's more theatrical moments of evil. In Season 4, the relationship began to deepen into something warmer and more genuinely affectionate, and this was the beginning of the shift away from evil Stewie and toward the more emotionally complex version of the character that would come to define his later seasons. The road to format continued to develop. The road to episodes in Seasons 4 and 5 were reliably the best episodes of their respective seasons' stories, with genuine internal logic, characters behaving in ways that felt motivated and consistent, comedy that arose from situation and character rather than disconnected from both. When you watch these episodes, you understand immediately why the format became so beloved. It forced the writers to tell an actual story, with Brian and Stewie as the protagonists, and the result was almost always more satisfying than the standard Peter-centered episode, because the story had somewhere to go and was going there with purpose. Season 5, which ran from 2006 to 2007, continued the trends and produced some genuinely excellent individual episodes. Stewie Loves Lois, the season premiere, turned the Stewie and Lois relationship completely on its head in ways that were surprising and funny and unexpectedly touching. The episode began with Stewie having a genuinely warm moment with Lois. She tends to him during a minor illness with a gentleness that cuts through his defenses, and Stewie, having spent his entire life plotting her destruction, finds himself overwhelmed by a sudden, completely unfamiliar feeling. Love for his mother. He becomes obsessed with her attention. He follows her everywhere. He declares his devotion in terms that are extravagant and theatrical and completely sincere. He is entirely unable to return to his previous posture of murderous indifference. It was a reversal that worked beautifully, finding genuine comedy and even some genuine feeling in the gap between Stewie's villain identity and his underlying vulnerability. Barely Legal, from the same season, was an episode built around Meg's crush on Brian after he takes her to prom out of pity. It was uncomfortable and funny in roughly equal measure uncomfortable, because Meg's feelings were real, and the situation put Brian in an impossible position. Funny because the show was committed to following the situation where it actually went, rather than sanitizing it into easy resolution. Meg's longing for genuine connection and Brian's discomfort at being the object of that longing were both handled with a care that suggested the show still knew how to treat its characters as full people when it chose to. But Season 5 also accelerated something troubling. The Meg abuse was beginning to escalate. In the first 3 seasons, the jokes about Meg had been gentle, relatively. She was overlooked, she was uncool, she was the ordinary one in an extraordinary household. In Season 4, and increasingly in Season 5, the jokes began to shift towards something crueler. Peter's comments about Meg's appearance became sharper. The family's contempt for her became more overt. The jokes were moving from laughing at her position to laughing at her existence, and the distinction matters enormously. The show had discovered that putting Meg down generated a certain kind of laugh, and it had begun returning to that well with increasing frequency. The Season 5 finale, No Meals on Wheels, was a solid episode that involved a restaurant subplot and the usual chaos. The season ended with the show in what felt like reasonable health, not at the peak of the original seasons, but still producing enough good work to justify the audience's continued attention. If you had watched Season 5's final episode and been told that this was a show in a gentle decline, you might have pushed back. The evidence was there, but it was not yet overwhelming. Part 5. The Cracks Become Breaks. Seasons 6 and 7. There is a moment in the aging of any long-running show when the trends that had been developing in the background become impossible to ignore, when what had been a slow drift becomes a visible turn, when the audience and the critics stop saying, "It's not quite what it was," and start saying, "Something has changed." For Family Guy, that moment arrived in Seasons 6 and 7. These 2 seasons are the bridge between the show people fell in love with and the show that would, in later years, frustrate many of those same people. Season 6 premiered on the 23rd of September 2007. The animation had shifted again. The work was now being handled at a new studio, Digital Emation, and the visual quality was different in ways that were hard to articulate but easy to feel. The characters moved with less expressiveness. The outlines were different. The timing of physical comedy was slightly off in ways that were not catastrophic but that accumulated across an episode into something subtly wrong. Comedy is precision work. A joke that lands at 4 seconds does not land at 5. The animation of the early seasons had a looseness and energy that made even its roughnesses feel alive. The animation of season 6 felt more clinical, more correct, less fun. The writing, too, was showing its strain in new ways. The cutaway gags were increasing in both frequency and length, where once they had been brief and tight in, joke, out, they now ran longer, sometimes significantly longer, and appeared more often per episode. The main storyline was getting thinner as more and more of the episode's runtime was absorbed by these disconnected moments. It was not yet at the point of becoming unwatchable, but the structural problem was there, and it was growing. Season 6 did produce what many fans consider to be among the most ambitious episodes in the show's history, the two-part Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie. In these episodes, Stewie finally does it. He actually kills Lois. She is shot on a cruise ship, her body falling into the ocean, and the first half ends with the Griffin family shattered by grief while Stewie prepares to take over the world. The second half shows Stewie's world domination in chilling, funny, dramatic detail until Lois returns, having survived somehow, and confronts Stewie in a showdown that is violent and tense and genuinely exciting in a way that Family Guy rarely managed in individual episodes. These episodes worked. They were thrilling. They gave the audience everything they had wanted from Stewie's evil genius concept for years. But they ended with a twist that revealed the entire story had taken place inside a simulation on Stewie's computer. None of it was real. Everything reset. And while that twist was clever in its own right, a logical extension of the show's long-standing habit of returning everything to the status quo, it also revealed something about where the show was heading. Philosophically, the stakes were not real. The consequences were not permanent. You could watch the most dramatic thing the show had ever done and know, at the end of it, that nothing had actually changed. This would become one of the defining qualities of Family Guy's later seasons. A show that could create dramatic events without ever allowing those events to matter. Characters could die and come back. Relationships could shatter and repair. The entire status quo could be upended and then, by the following episode, restored as if nothing had happened. A show that cannot commit to consequences is a show that cannot earn genuine investment from its audience, because investment requires the possibility of loss. Season 6 also saw the further diminishment of the evil genius Stewie. After the two-parter, his world domination plots became genuinely rare occasional callbacks rather than central features of his character. The Stewie who appeared week to week was increasingly emotional, increasingly social, increasingly Brian-focused. He was still funny. He still had moments of brilliant eccentricity. But the character who had once made every scene feel charged with possibility because he might say anything, do anything, reveal some new layer of his genius or his malevolence, at any moment was being replaced by something more predictable, more comfortable, and ultimately less irreplaceable. Then, in November 2007, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. This was a massive labor action. Thousands of writers across film and television refusing to work in a fight over residuals and compensation for digital distribution. As content increasingly moved online, and the studios sought to minimize the payments writers received for that distribution, the strike lasted approximately 3 months, from November 2007 to the 12th of February 2008, and it disrupted virtually every scripted show on American television. MacFarlane was a committed supporter of the Guild. He joined the picket lines. He was vocal in his support for the writers and their demands. During the strike, Fox made the decision to air 3 episodes of Family Guy that had already been completed before the walkout began episodes. They had the contractual right to broadcast, but that MacFarlane had preferred they hold until the strike was resolved. The decision to air them without his blessing created friction between MacFarlane and the network, an early and concrete instance of the tension that would grow between them over the following years. The strike ended in February 2008, and Family Guy resumed with the episode Back to the Woods. But the creative damage was done. 3 months away from the writing room, 3 months of disrupted rhythm and scattered focus, is not simply recovered from when writers come back to their desks. Television production runs on momentum. Stories are planned weeks and months ahead. Character arcs are built across half seasons. When that forward motion is stopped and then restarted, there is almost always a seam, a visible place where the material before the disruption and the material after it do not quite match. Season 7, which ran from 2008 to 2009, continued the trends of Season 6 with some new additions that would become defining characteristics of the show going forward. The humor was leaning increasingly on shock value rather than craft. In the early seasons, the show had been edgy and sometimes dark, but its darkness had always been purposeful. The shock was in service of something, whether a satirical point, a character revelation, or a particularly inventive piece of comedic construction. By Season 7, the relationship between shock and purpose was inverting. The shock was becoming the point. The show would do something extreme and expect the extremity itself to generate the laugh. The episode 420, in which Brian leads a successful campaign to legalize marijuana in the Griffins' hometown, created actual international controversy. The Venezuelan government took enough offense at the episode's content to ban Family Guy from their cable networks, with the country's justice minister citing it as an example of United States media promoting drug use. Whatever you think of the episode itself, the fact that it was generating this level of real-world reaction spoke to a show that was pushing further and further into territory that went beyond the kind of edgy but crafted humor of the early years. The provocation was becoming an end in itself. Season 7 also introduced what would become one of the most consistently criticized tendencies of the later show: the extended gag. The joke stretched far past the point where it was funny, held in place by what seemed like an expectation that sheer duration would eventually circle back around to comedy. A scene of Peter hurting himself falling, catching his knee on something, sitting on the floor in pain that should have lasted 5 seconds would run for 30, 40, sometimes close to a full minute of the same moment repeating. The Conway Twitty gag, which appeared multiple times across seasons, was perhaps the most extreme version of this tendency. The show would simply cut to a full, unedited performance of the late country singer Conway Twitty performing one of his songs, running for what felt like an eternity, with no punchline beyond the fact that it was happening. Some viewers found it funny in its audacity the first time. By the third and fourth iteration, it was widely understood as exactly what it was: time filler. A way to pad an episode that did not have enough material to fill its runtime with actual comedy. Season 7 did produce some genuinely strong individual episodes. Road to Germany was one of them, an episode in which Brian, Stewie, and their Jewish neighbor, Mort Goldman, accidentally end up in 1939 Germany at the very beginning of the Second World War. What followed was a genuinely tense and genuinely funny adventure. The episode used the historical setting with more care than you might expect from a show that was increasingly accused of recklessness, building real stakes around the characters' need to escape, and using the horror of the setting as a genuine backdrop rather than just a source of cheap jokes. It was, alongside The Road to the North Pole and Road to the Multiverse, one of the strongest entries in the format. I Dream of Jesus, from the same season, was a smaller-scale comedy built around Peter's discovery of an old record from the 1960s containing the song Surfin' Bird, and his subsequent obsession with playing it constantly to the complete misery of everyone around him. The episode was absurd and committed and funny, and it produced one of the most shared video clips in the show's history. Meg destroying the record, the family celebrating, Peter's devastation. Small, self-contained, entirely effective. But the trend was visible. The jokes were getting broader. The shock was increasingly disconnected from craft. The characters were drifting further from the people they had been in the original seasons. And the extended jokes, the gags held past their natural endpoint, as if duration alone could generate comedy, were becoming a regular habit rather than an occasional experiment. Despite all of this, seasons 6 and 7 were not unwatchable. They were inconsistent, capable of producing genuinely wonderful episodes alongside ones that felt tired or mean-spirited or simply padded. But the talent in the room and in the recording booth was still real and showed, often enough to keep the audience engaged. These were the last seasons where you could make a reasonable argument that Family Guy was still mostly working. The golden era was clearly over. The question was whether the show was in a rough patch or a permanent decline. We know the answer now. Looking back, though, at the time it was not yet settled. After Season 7, the argument that the show was mostly working became much harder to sustain. Part 6. The Dark Seasons 8 through 12. The seasons that run from 8 through 12 represent what many fans and critics consider the show's most troubled period, and that description is accurate, even acknowledging how much good work those seasons also produced. These are the years when the problems that had been developing since the revival hit their peak simultaneously. Peter became genuinely cruel rather than accidentally harmful. Brian became actively insufferable rather than pleasantly flawed. Meg's abuse escalated from mean-spirited comedy into something that was difficult to defend as comedy at all. The show's reliance on disconnected shock humor was at its most pronounced. Cutaway gags were fully in control of the pacing. And the show produced in Season 12 the single most talked-about event in its entire run, the death and immediate resurrection of Brian Griffin. These were also the seasons that gave the world Road to the Multiverse and Brian and Stewie two of the finest individual episodes the show ever produced. They were the seasons of Quagmire's devastating speech about Brian, which was one of the most cathartic moments of explicit character criticism that the show ever managed. They were the seasons of Back to the Pilot, of the extended North Pole Christmas special, of individual moments that could still take your breath away even when the episode surrounding them was going wrong. The best and the worst of Family Guy coexisted in this period with a particular vividness, the gap between the show's peaks and valleys wider than it had ever been. You could watch a brilliant road to episode one week and a genuinely uncomfortable Meg abuse episode the next, and wonder whether you were watching the same show. In a meaningful sense, you were not. Peter Griffin's character arc, or rather the absence of a character arc, the deliberate erasure of the growth and accountability that had defined early Peter, was nearly complete by Season 8. The man who had once ended episodes by going to Lois and apologizing, genuinely and with felt remorse, for whatever chaos he had caused that week had become something different. He was now capable of actions that the early Peter would never have committed. Pushing Lois into the ocean when he thought a shark was approaching and running away in the boat while she was left behind. Stealing Halloween candy from Stewie from his own infant. Deliberately sabotaging his friend Joe's marriage. Getting Brian fired from a mascot position out of nothing more than spite. The show had always relied on Peter's bad decisions for comedic energy. But bad decisions made by a man who fundamentally means well are funny in a way that bad decisions made by a man who simply does not care are not. The famous moment in Season 10's Seahorse Seashell Party, where Meg finally snaps and delivers a comprehensive indictment of her family's treatment of her, made this explicit. Everything Meg said in that speech was accurate. Every behavior she described was something the show had depicted. And Peter's response was to laugh. Not the sheepish, cornered laugh of a man who knows he has been caught, the laugh of someone who genuinely found the accusation amusing. The early Peter would have been hurt. The early Peter would have looked at his daughter's pain and felt it, even if he struggled to express what he felt. The later Peter felt nothing. What made the Meg situation particularly uncomfortable across these seasons was the escalating nature of the abuse. In the early seasons, Meg was overlooked and occasionally the subject of gentle mockery. By seasons 8 through 12, the treatment had become operatic in its cruelty. Peter farting in her face as a form of entertainment, not occasionally, but repeatedly, across multiple episodes. The reveal in a later flashback that Peter and Lois had attempted to abandon infant Meg at a fire station played as a joke. Peter going undercover at Meg's high school and abandoning her in favor of the popular kids. The entire family gathered against her in a unified front of contempt. Mila Kunis, who had replaced Lacey Chabert as Meg's voice beginning in Season 2, later spoke publicly about the real-world impact of voicing a character whose defining quality was being universally despised. People would repeat Peter's dismissive catchphrase, directed at Meg to Kunis personally, as if the fictional cruelty had licensed a real-world echo. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party also delivered what many fans consider the most troubling resolution of the show's run. After Meg's speech, the family falls apart without her as their shared target. They turn on each other, and the dynamic collapses. And so Meg, after a conversation with Brian, voluntarily takes her speech back. She accepts her role as the family's punching bag. She returns to the position she had just, with real clarity and pain, described as intolerable. The episode frames this as Meg being the most mature, most selfless member of the family, the one who holds them together by absorbing their cruelty. The message that lands, whatever the writers intended, is that victims of sustained abuse should accept their suffering because the alternative is too disruptive for the people who are hurting them. Brian's decline across these seasons was perhaps the most painful to watch, because it was the decline of the character who had once been the most relatable and the most real. The smart, empathetic, flawed but genuinely kind dog of the early seasons was being replaced, layer by layer, with something arrogant, dishonest, and deeply hypocritical. The episode Brian Writes a Bestseller in Season 9 showed it at its most acute. Brian, encouraged by Stewie to return to writing, produces a self-help book that becomes a massive commercial success, and then treats Stewie, the person whose encouragement made it possible, with complete contempt. He belittles Stewie. He is ungrateful, dismissive, cruel toward the one creature who believed in him when he had given up on himself. The episode Jerome is the New Black in Season 8 gave the world Quagmire's famous speech a comprehensive, articulate, emotionally charged inventory of everything that was wrong with Brian, delivered by a character who was himself far from saintly but who saw Brian with extraordinary clarity. Quagmire called out Brian's pretension, his failures, his hypocrisy, his bad behavior toward Lois, his abandonment of his own son Dylan, his fundamental phoniness. Every single thing Quagmire said was true, and the show knew it was true, and the audience knew it was true. The speech was widely praised because it articulated something that had been building for years in fan discussion. This character has become insufferable, and put it into explicit, dramatic form. But the show used the speech as a release valve rather than a turning point. It acknowledged the problem publicly and then continued the problem as if the acknowledgement were sufficient. Brian's behavior did not improve after Quagmire's speech. If anything, the feud between them became a new source of escalating bad behavior from Brian, who responded to being called out by becoming increasingly petty and antagonistic toward Quagmire in the episodes that followed. The road to episodes which continued into these seasons remained the bright spots. Road to the Multiverse in Season 8 is frequently cited as one of the best episodes the show ever produced. Brian and Stewie traveling across alternate versions of reality, each with its own distinct visual style and comedic logic, the episode escalating beautifully through a series of increasingly inventive alternate versions of the Griffin's world until it reached a finale that was funny and surprisingly sweet. Road to the North Pole in Season 9 was another genuine triumph, a Christmas episode that was dark and funny and ultimately warm. The show finding a way to take the jolly Christmas special format and run it through a Family Guy lens without losing the genuine feeling that the holidays can produce. Stewie's desire to confront Santa for an insult at the mall leads to a journey to the actual North Pole, which turns out to be a nightmarish industrial wasteland run by a burned-out, physically destroyed Santa and staffed by elves, deformed by generations of inbreeding. The visual of the real North Pole, the horror and the comedy of it, was one of the show's great inventions, and the episode's final turn, where Brian and Stewie go on television to beg the world to scale back its holiday demands and let Santa recover, had a genuine sweetness that earned the warmth it asked for. Season 8 also produced Road to the Multiverse, the Brian and Stewie episode that many fans consider the greatest single episode in the show's entire run. The premise was as inventive as anything the show had ever attempted. Stewie has built a device capable of traveling to parallel universes, and he and Brian jump between them, finding alternate versions of their Rhode Island town that operate under completely different visual and conceptual rules. One universe is Disney animated, complete with talking animals and musical numbers rendered in the style of a 1940s feature. One universe is set in a world where World War II ended differently, with Japan having won. One universe operates on the logic of Flintstones-era animation. One universe is a robot universe. Each transition required the show to completely reinvent its visual language for a scene, and the episode pulled it off with remarkable consistency. The comedy was matched by genuine craft in the execution, and the episode demonstrated conclusively what Family Guy was capable of when it combined inventive storytelling with real commitment to its own creative logic. Season 8 also produced Brian and Stewie, the bottle episode. Nothing else. No cutaway gags, no subplots, no other characters appearing. Just Brian and Stewie, accidentally locked in a bank vault over a long weekend, talking. Not performing. Talking. The episode went to places that the show almost never visited. Brian revealing he had a gun in his safety deposit box, and the reason he kept it there, which was that he had thought about ending his own life. Stewie revealing the depth of his love for Brian, not as a joke, not wrapped in irony or deflected by a punchline, but as a genuine and unguarded declaration. two characters finding their way through the particular kind of honesty that only becomes possible when there is nothing left to do but be honest. It was written by Gary Janetti and was widely praised as evidence that Family Guy was still capable of producing genuinely affecting character work when it chose to commit to it. The episode proved that the show did not need its signature formal device to be compelling. It needed good writing and characters worth caring about. It had both, in this episode, completely. And then, in November 2013, came the moment that made national headlines. Season 12, Episode 6, Life of Brian. The episode began like any other, the Griffins having an ordinary day, Brian and Stewie playing street hockey, ordinary domestic chaos, and then a car came around the corner, and Brian was struck, and the episode took a turn that nobody was prepared for. Brian died. In the hospital, surrounded by the family he had lived with since the beginning, the talking dog who had been there from the first episode breathed his last. The family mourned. Stewie was devastated not in a performative way, but in a way that felt genuinely shattering, the friendship between them mattering enough to break him. A new dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico of Sopranos fame, was introduced to replace Brian, and the show went on. The internet did not take it quietly. Brian's death trended on social media for days. Fans organized petitions. Online discussions were heated and vast. Some people were heartbroken. Some were furious. Some were both. For a show in its 12th season, whose ratings had been declining for years, the death of Brian Griffin was the most significant cultural moment it had generated in some time. Seth MacFarlane later acknowledged that the reaction surprised the team. They knew it would create a stir, but the depth of the anger was beyond what they had expected. 2 episodes later, in the Christmas episode, Christmas Guy, Stewie used a time machine obtained from a future version of himself, who appeared specifically for this purpose, to go back to the moment before Brian was struck by the car and push him out of the vehicle's path. Brian was restored to life. Vinny was erased from the timeline as if he had never been there. The family did not remember any of it. Everything went back to exactly where it had been before Life of Brian aired. Seth MacFarlane spoke about the reaction afterward, acknowledging that the team had been surprised by the depth of the audience's distress. They had expected controversy. They had expected people to be upset. But the specific character of the anger, its sincerity, its emotional weight, the sense that people were genuinely grieving rather than performing outrage went beyond what anyone had anticipated. This reaction told them something. Brian Griffin, even in the more problematic form he had taken in the preceding seasons, still mattered deeply to the people watching. The reaction to the resurrection was quieter, but in some ways more telling. The relief was real, but alongside it was a widespread and specific sense of having been used. The death had been a calculated move, a story choice designed to generate buzz and sustain cultural visibility at a moment when the show's ratings were declining. And the almost immediate reversal made that calculation visible in retrospect. The grief the audience had been asked to experience, the adjustment they had been asked to make, all of it was taken back. The show moved you, then moved you back, and the moving had served the show's promotional needs rather than any lasting creative purpose. This is the moment that many long-term Family Guy fans point to when they try to describe their complicated relationship with the later seasons. Not just that Brian died, that he died and came back in a way that retroactively stripped the death of meaning, and in doing so demonstrated something important about the show's philosophy. Nothing that happened needed to stick. The status quo could always be restored, and the audience's emotional investment was a resource to be deployed, rather than a relationship to be honored. Part 7. The long middle seasons, 13 through 20. If the dark seasons represented Family Guy at its most troubled in terms of character and tone, the middle period that followed was something else entirely. A long, gradual, unspectacular accommodation. The show did not suddenly get dramatically better, nor did it fall to new lows. It found a kind of sustainable mediocrity, a rhythm it could maintain indefinitely, producing episodes that ranged from genuinely funny to forgettable, that still had flashes of the old brilliance while never quite recapturing the consistent warmth and craft of the original 3 seasons. Season 13, which ran from 2014 to 2015, was notable partly for what it did with Meg. The Simpsons crossover episode in Season 13 brought Meg into contact with Lisa Simpson, and the two characters discovered an unexpected kinship, two smart, overlooked daughters in chaotic households, finding in each other a recognition and encouragement they rarely received at home. The episode gave Meg a talent, the saxophone, which she learned to play beautifully, a hidden ability that had been waiting inside her all along. It was a warm episode, and it treated Meg with the care and genuine interest that the previous 10 seasons had mostly denied her. And, as had happened before, the following episodes largely ignored what this episode had established. The addition of more women to the writing staff in later seasons did correlate with a measurable decrease in the most extreme Meg abuse. By season 14 and into 15, the worst of the systematic cruelty toward Meg was being pulled back. She began to fight back against her tormentors rather than simply absorbing their abuse. She had episodes where she was competent and even impressive. The change was gradual and not always consistent, but it was real, and it made her character for the first time in years feel like someone the show actually wanted to develop rather than simply use. Season 14's Peter's Sister was one of the most ambitious character episodes the show produced in this long middle period. It introduced Peter's sister Karen, who turns out to have bullied and abused Peter throughout their childhood in ways that were extreme and genuinely damaging. The episode made explicit what the show had never quite articulated, that Peter's cruelty toward Meg was a cycle, a pattern absorbed from his own childhood, the behavior of someone who was raised with abuse and never learned another way to exist with the people around him. Meg learns this and responds not with anger but with empathy. And Peter and Meg reach a genuine reconciliation, honest, emotionally real, the two of them looking at each other with something approaching understanding. It was a strong episode. And then the next week, things were back to normal. This was the defining pattern of these seasons. The show demonstrating periodically that it understood who its characters were supposed to be and what they were capable of, and then resetting to the mean. The resets were not malicious. They were structural, the result of a show that had never built a system for remembering what its characters learned. Every episode needed to begin from a stable baseline, and the stable baseline for the Griffin family in these seasons was dysfunction without growth. Moments of genuine change could happen within an episode, but they could not persist into the next one, because the next one would need to begin from the same starting point. The road to episodes remained the most consistently rewarding format the show had found in its post-revival years. Road to the Multiverse had been a high point of Season 8. Road to the North Pole had been a high point of Season 9. These episodes continued through the middle seasons, each one finding new ways to use the Brian and Stewie dynamic, their fundamental incompatibility, their genuine affection for each other, the comedy of watching them navigate impossible situations in the company of someone who is simultaneously your best friend and the most irritating presence in your life. Road to Vegas in Season 11 was structurally clever in a way that the show did not always manage. The episode split Brian and Stewie into two parallel versions of themselves, created by a transporter accident that produced duplicates rather than a single, successful transport. One Brian and Stewie had a wonderful Las Vegas trip, charmed, lucky, everything going right. The other pair had a catastrophic one, unlucky, miserable, every possible thing going wrong. The episode tracked both experiences simultaneously, bringing them together in a finale that honored both storylines and found something genuinely moving in the contrast. It was the kind of episode that required genuine structural thinking to pull off, and the show pulled it off. Road to India, in Season 15, sent Brian and Stewie to Mumbai in pursuit of a woman Brian had fallen in love with online, only to discover that the person he had been communicating with was not what he had imagined. The episode was less emotionally resonant than the best Road to entries, but demonstrated that the format still had room to explore new geographical and comedic territory. Road to the Past in Season 14 used the time travel device that had always been Stewie's most reliable toy to explore formative moments in the Griffins' history, finding comedy and something approaching genuine feeling in the spaces between what the audience knew about these characters and what they might have been before the show began. What the Road to format demonstrated, consistently across all of its entries, was that Family Guy had always been a better show when it was telling a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The structure forced discipline. Without cutaways to fall back on, without the ability to fill time with disconnected gags, the writers had to make every scene carry weight. The comedy had to arise from character and situation, rather than being imported from outside the story. The result was almost always stronger, more satisfying, more emotionally complete than the average episode of the same season. The show's musical numbers continued to be a genuine strength across these seasons. Family Guy had always been willing to break into original songs, and the quality of those songs written primarily by Walter Murphy, who had composed the show's iconic theme, was consistently high. The song Christmas Time Is Killing Us, from Road to the North Pole, had been nominated for a Grammy Award. You and I Are So Awfully Different from the original Road to Europe had won MacFarlane a Primetime Emmy. These were not isolated achievements. The show produced original music with a frequency and a quality that most animated comedies never approached, and the songs functioned as genuine creative achievements rather than simply as vehicles for plot. Season 16, which aired in 2017 and 2018, produced Emmy-winning episode, a deeply meta installment in which the show deliberately tried to engineer an Emmy Award nomination by including all the elements it assumed the Television Academy looked for. The episode was funny in the specific way that Family Guy was always at its funniest, when it was looking at itself sideways, acknowledging its own absurdity while simultaneously performing it, finding comedy in the gap between what the show was and what it might be trying to be. The self-awareness of the later seasons was a genuine comedic resource when it was deployed with precision. The problem was when self-awareness substituted for actual improvement, when the show acknowledged that it had problems, and then treated the acknowledgement as if it were the same as addressing them. Season 17 saw the departure of Mike Henry from the role of Cleveland Brown, a character he had voiced since the show's very first season. Henry announced his decision in 2020, citing a growing consensus that animated characters of color should be voiced by actors of color. Cleveland, who had been a supporting character in Family Guy before getting his own spin-off series, The Cleveland Show, which ran from 2009 to 2013 on Fox before being canceled, transitioned to the voice of Arif Zahir beginning in season 19. The change was handled as smoothly as these transitions can be, and Zahir brought his own warmth and specificity to the role. The show's relationship with Fox was becoming increasingly complicated through these seasons. MacFarlane had always had creative tensions with the network. The airing of episodes without his permission during the 2007 writers' strike had been an early instance, but the tensions were growing more personal and more public. In 2021, MacFarlane posted on Twitter that Fox News host Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on a different network. He compared his relationship with Fox to a failing marriage. This was the creator of one of the network's longest-running shows saying, in public, that he did not want to be there. It was a remarkable statement, and it reflected the reality of a situation that had been growing more difficult for years. MacFarlane had signed a deal with NBC Universal in 2020, reportedly worth in the neighborhood of $200 million over 5 years, moving his production company Fuzzy Door Productions into the Comcast family of networks. His newer projects, The Orville, which had launched in 2017 and moved from Fox to Hulu for its later seasons, and the live-action Ted prequel series for Peacock were being developed and produced entirely outside the Fox ecosystem. MacFarlane was building his creative future elsewhere, in projects that he controlled fully, that bore his creative fingerprint on every level the way Family Guy had borne it in those first 3 seasons. Family Guy was the thing keeping him tied to a network he had publicly expressed frustration with. He showed up for voice recording, and his voice work remained excellent throughout these seasons. His performances as Peter and Brian, and Stewie and Quagmire still sharp and specific and alive, still capable of finding the exact emotional register each scene required. But the creative steering, the day-to-day writing direction, the decisions about where stories went and how characters were written, all of that was in other hands. In April 2024, MacFarlane gave an interview discussing Family Guy's future. He said he did not see a good reason to stop making the show, noting that it made people happy and that it helped fund causes he cared about, including environmental conservation through organizations like Rainforest Trust. He framed the show's continued existence in terms of utility and demand, rather than creative urgency. There was no mention of exciting new directions he wanted to explore, or characters he wanted to develop, or stories he had been waiting to tell. The show was continuing because it could, and because people still watched it, and because the economics supported it. That is a perfectly reasonable position for a creator to take about a show after 25 years. But it is a very different position from the one he occupied when he was 24 years old and drawing every character by hand at home because there was no other way to bring what he was imagining into being. The showrunning team of Rich Appel and Alex Sulkin, who had been guiding the show since the early 2010s, were capable and knowledgeable. They had been with the show for years. They understood its mechanics, its rhythms, its formal vocabulary, the specific quality of the show's humor, and the specific dynamics between its characters. This is not a small thing. Running a long-form animated series is a craft that requires enormous skill and consistency, and Appel and Sulkin demonstrated both across many seasons. But there is a difference between understanding a show and being the person whose creative vision it embodies. The writers who worked on Family Guy during the Appel-Sulkin era were talented professionals who knew the show well. What they could not replicate was the specific combination of instinct and passion that had made the early show what it was. The quality of something being made by a person who knew exactly what they wanted, who had spent years building toward a specific vision, who could feel immediately when something was wrong because they had a clear internal standard against which they were measuring it. MacFarlane in 1999 had that quality in abundance. The institutional memory of the show contained traces of it, visible in the best episodes of every subsequent season. But the active, living presence of it, the person in the room who could say no to this and yes to that with the authority of genuine creative ownership, was absent, and the absence was felt. The show was competently maintained. It was not guided by the original passion that had created it. Those two things can coexist in the same production, and they did, and the result was the particular quality of Family Guy in its middle and later seasons. A show that knew how to do all the things that made Family Guy, but that did not always know why those things mattered or where their limits were. Season 20 of Family Guy averaged just 1.31 million viewers, with a rating of 0.45 in the 18 to 49 demographic that advertisers value most. For context, the show's fourth season return had averaged around 7.9 million viewers. The mathematical reality of that decline from roughly 8 million viewers to roughly 1.3 million across 15 seasons was significant and real, even accounting for the industry-wide fragmentation of television audiences that streaming had caused. Every show on broadcast television was losing viewers to streaming, but Family Guy was losing them at a rate that outpaced the broader trend, and that gap between its decline and the market decline told you something about how its specific relationship with its audience had changed. The show still existed in streaming, still accumulated viewers on Hulu, still generated enormous revenue through syndication on Adult Swim and Comedy Central and FXX and the various other platforms that carried its library. The financial argument for continuing to produce Family Guy remained clear even as the broadcast ratings fell. Animated shows are cheap to produce relative to their revenue. The cost per episode of Family Guy was a fraction of what a live-action drama would cost. The revenue it generated through licensing and syndication and streaming and merchandise was substantially larger than what the broadcast ratings alone would suggest. The show was, by any financial measure, still commercially viable. The question of whether it was still artistically alive was a different kind of question, and one that the numbers did not answer. Something fundamental had changed in the relationship between the show and the audience that had once loved it so passionately that they had bought enough DVDs to resurrect it from cancellation. That audience had not disappeared. They were still out there, watching the older episodes on streaming services, passing clips around on social media, keeping the show alive in the cultural conversation in ways that the Wednesday night ratings did not fully capture. What had changed was the sense of occasion. In 2005, watching a new Family Guy episode was an event, something you made time for, something you talked about with people the next day. By 2022, it was something you caught up with when you got around to it, or did not. Part 8, The Modern Griffin Family Seasons 21 through 24, and What Comes Next. When Family Guy was moved from Sunday nights to Wednesday nights for the 2023 to 2024 broadcast season, most people in the television industry understood what it meant. Sunday night on Fox had been the show's home for most of its post-revival life. It had been the anchor of animation domination, the programming block that had defined Fox's Sunday schedule for 2 decades. Moving to Wednesday was not presented as a promotion. It was the network acknowledging, in the practical language of scheduling decisions, that the show's relationship with prime Sunday real estate was ending. The last time Family Guy had aired on a weekday was in 2002, during the troubled final months of its original run before the second cancellation. The echo of that history was uncomfortable, and it was not lost on longtime fans. Consider the numbers for a moment, because the numbers tell a specific and undeniable story. Season 22 averaged around 972,000 viewers, less than 1 million people watching new episodes of a show that had once drawn 22 million for its very first broadcast. That is a drop of approximately 96% from the peak. Season 23, which premiered in February 2025 after two Hulu-exclusive holiday specials in the fall of 2024, averaged roughly 1.1 million viewers, a modest uptick that reflected the show's continued cultural presence even as its live broadcast viewership had contracted dramatically. These numbers sound catastrophic when compared to the early seasons, but they need to be understood in context. The context is this: the entire landscape of how people watch television had been transformed so completely between 1999 and 2025 that comparing raw viewership numbers from those two periods is almost meaningless. In 1999, if you wanted to watch Family Guy, you watched it on Fox on Sunday night at whatever time Fox scheduled it. That was the option. There was no streaming. There was no DVR in any widespread sense. There was no YouTube or TikTok serving you clips at all hours of every day. The audience was concentrated because the channels of distribution were limited. By 2025, Family Guy's total audience, counting Hulu subscribers who watched episodes on demand, counting Adult Swim reruns that had returned to the block, counting the millions of clips viewed daily on social media, was almost certainly larger than the broadcast numbers suggested. The show was genuinely popular in a fragmented, distributed, hard-to-count way that the Nielsen system was not designed to measure. The shift to Hulu for holiday specials was itself a sign of how the show had adapted to this new landscape. The Season 23 Halloween special, A Little Fright Music, in which Brian and Stewie try to write a definitive Halloween song while Peter's trick-or-treating adventure takes a characteristically dark turn, premiered on Hulu in October 2024 rather than on broadcast Fox. The Christmas special followed on Hulu in November. The regular season episodes then began on Fox in February 2025. This was the show operating as a dual-platform property, using streaming for the prestige event episodes while maintaining broadcast for the regular season, a structure that would have been incomprehensible in 1999, but made complete business sense in 2025. But here is the thing that makes the story of Family Guy genuinely complicated and genuinely interesting, rather than a simple tale of decline. The show at 23 seasons was, in many ways, more watchable than it had been at its lowest points in seasons 8 through 12. The megabuse had genuinely subsided. The writers had found ways to let her be competent, tough, interesting, someone with an actual personality rather than simply a target. Peter was still broadly written, still capable of selfishness and chaos, but the very worst of the cruelty that had defined his character in the dark seasons was less constant. Stewie, while long since separated from his evil genius roots, had been developed through his friendship with Brian and his various adventures into something that had its own internal logic and its own genuine warmth. Season 23 and into Season 24 continued to explore the characters in ways that were sometimes genuinely inventive. Brian and Stewie's relationship remained the show's most reliable engine of real-feeling episodes built around their friendship. Still had the capacity to land emotional punches that the more chaotic Peter-centered stories could not manage. The road to format, though it appeared less frequently than in its heyday, still produced worthwhile entries when the writers committed to it. The show's formal relationship with its own history became increasingly central. Later seasons regularly looked backward, revisiting old episodes, acknowledging the show's length, making jokes about how much had changed and how little had changed. The episode Back to the Pilot in Season 10, where Brian and Stewie visit the events of the very first episode, was an early example of this. Later seasons continued the practice, with episodes that self-consciously positioned themselves in relation to the show's quarter-century history. Family Guy at 24 seasons was a show that was deeply, sometimes uncomfortably, aware of how long it had been running. In April 2025, a significant announcement arrived. Disney, which had acquired Fox's entertainment assets in 2019 and therefore owned Family Guy, announced a major renewal deal that would take the show through its 27th season and the 2028 to 2029 television season. Each season under the new deal would consist of 15 episodes. The show was being guaranteed several more years of existence, which would bring it to its 30th anniversary, a milestone that virtually no one would have predicted was possible back in 2002 when the second cancellation was announced. And then, in March 2026, another announcement. Fox had ordered 2 seasons of a new spin-off series called Stewie. The series would follow Stewie Griffin no longer in his original family home but in preschool. Enrolled in an institution his parents chose after his original school, expelled him as he navigates the social world of early childhood while building devices and pursuing adventures through time and space. Seth MacFarlane was announced as a co-creator alongside writer Kirker Butler, with both serving as executive producers. The series was set to premiere during the 2027 to 2028 season. The Stewie spin-off was, depending on how you looked at it, either a correction or an admission. If you believed, as many fans did, that the original Stewie's evil genius concept still had untapped potential, that the show had retired it too early, had given up on what made the character truly original, before exhausting what that concept could do, then a new series focused on Stewie, apparently leaning back toward his more inventive and boundary-pushing qualities, could be understood as the show's universe acknowledging that something had been left behind. Whether Stewie would actually return to the character as he was in 1999 and 2000 and 2001, the genuinely terrifying baby in the yellow onesie, building laser weapons between naps and delivering monologues of villainous grandeur, or whether it would continue the softer, more emotionally accessible version of the character that the main series had developed over 20 seasons, remained to be seen. What is certain is that the Stewie character, even in his more domesticated form, retains something that the original had in abundance: a voice. A specific, particular, unmistakable voice. Seth MacFarlane's performance of Stewie has been one of the most consistent and most brilliantly realized pieces of voice acting in American animation history. The character sounds like nobody else. He exists in a category entirely of his own making. Whatever the spin-off does with his story, it will have that voice to build from. The Stewie spin-off announcement, when it came in March 2026, was received by fans with a mixture of anticipation and cautious uncertainty. The uncertainty was reasonable. The history of television spin-offs from long-running animated comedies is not uniformly encouraging. But the specific circumstances of this one, MacFarlane's direct involvement as co-creator, the premise's apparent willingness to put Stewie back in a context where his inventiveness and his ambition could be the central engine of the story, the potential to recapture something of what the original character had been, made it genuinely interesting rather than merely formulaic. The description of the show suggested Stewie expelled from preschool and enrolled in an inferior institution, where he continues his experiments with time and space. If that premise allowed the writers to put the baby genius in situations where his intelligence and creativity were the driving forces of the comedy, where he was not simply the emotional heart of a buddy adventure with Brian, but was actively scheming and building and pursuing his own agenda, it would be, in the truest sense, a return to what had made the character special in 1999. Whether that opportunity was taken would determine what Stewie actually became. But the opportunity existed, and that in itself was worth something. The broader Family Guy universe had expanded and contracted over its 25 years in ways that were sometimes surprising and sometimes entirely logical. The Cleveland Show, a spin-off centered on Cleveland Brown that ran for 4 seasons on Fox from 2009 to 2013, had given Cleveland a complete solo story before he returned to the main show, his voice eventually taken over by Arif Zahir following Mike Henry's 2020 departure. The crossover events, particularly the Night of the Hurricane, 3-part special in which a hurricane simultaneously hits the Griffins' hometown, Langley Falls and Stoolbend, crossing the worlds of Family Guy and American Dad and The Cleveland Show, had shown that the extended MacFarlane animation universe could be deployed effectively when the writers were given enough time and creative latitude to do the crossover properly. The continuing story of Family Guy, of Peter and Lois and Brian and Stewie and Meg and Chris, of Spooner Street and the Drunken Clam and all the recurring figures who have become fixtures of this fictional Rhode Island universe is, at its best moments, a story about something genuinely universal, the particular comedy of people who love each other and still manage to make each other's lives far more complicated than they need to be. The lovable fool who means well and the woman who loves him anyway and has never stopped choosing to love him. The dog who carries literary ambitions and an intellectual identity that his actual circumstances consistently refuse to validate. The baby who is an infinite soul in a tiny body and knows it in his specific way. The teenager who has been asking to be seen for 25 years, and in the later seasons, slowly, the show has been beginning to see her. At its best moments, and there have been best moments scattered across all 24 seasons, Right up through the most recent episodes, Family Guy is still recognizably itself. Still funny in the specific way it has always been funny. Still capable of the unexpected joke, the moment of genuine warmth, the scene that does something you did not expect and lands with more weight than you were prepared for. The show has changed enormously since 1999. Some of those changes were losses, some were genuine gains. The relationship between Brian and Stewie in the later seasons is something that did not exist in the original three. It is something the show built carefully over years, and it has its own value. The moments of genuine emotional honesty that the Bottle episode and the Road to episodes produced are things that the original show, with its tighter comedic discipline and its more bounded emotional range, might not have reached for. The recurring characters who surrounded the Griffins across all 24 seasons deserve a moment of recognition in any complete account of the show. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, patient, occasionally frustrated, eventually given her own agency in later seasons as the writers allowed her to become a more fully realized person than the long-suffering spouse she had been reduced to in the darker middle seasons. Quagmire, who was always more complex than his defining characteristics suggested, whose arc across 24 seasons included moments of genuine vulnerability and genuine ugliness in almost equal measure. Herbert, the elderly man who lived nearby and whose specific kind of menace the show handled with a tonal precision that was always slightly uncomfortable and was probably supposed to be. Tom Tucker, the local news anchor, and Diane Simmons, his co-anchor through the early seasons, and the various newsroom colleagues who appeared in the show's regular news broadcasts, a recurring framing device that gave the writers an outlet for satirical commentary on whatever was happening in the episode or the world. The chicken, the giant chicken, as he is usually identified, deserves particular mention as one of the show's most singular inventions. Beginning with a coupon dispute in Season 2's Da Boom, Peter and the giant chicken have engaged in extended, elaborately choreographed, building-destroying, city-threatening brawls across the show's entire run. The fights are always absurdly long. They are always escalatingly destructive. They end with both combatants battered and the surrounding environment in ruins, after which they part ways until some future episode provides an occasion for the next confrontation. The chicken fights work because they commit to their own absurdity with total seriousness. The choreography is detailed. The destruction is specific. The scale keeps increasing. And they operate as a kind of pressure valve for the show, a moment where cartoon violence is allowed to be exactly as cartoon as possible, freed from any pretense of consequence or realism. The golden years, the first 3 seasons, the careful balance of absurdity and heart that defined them, the Stewie who wanted to destroy his mother, and the Brian who watched it all with loving exasperation, and the Peter who caused catastrophe and apologized for it afterward, those years remain exactly what they always were. Nothing in the 21 subsequent seasons has erased them. They are still there, available to anyone who wants to go back, exactly as good as they seemed when they first aired. They sit in the record permanently. The show that came after them was complicated and uneven, and sometimes brilliant, and sometimes deeply problematic, but it could not reach backward and diminish what those first 29 episodes were. The television landscape that Family Guy has survived to navigate in 2026 is so different from the one it was born into in 1999 that the continuity between them seems almost implausible. The show premiered in a world of appointment television, a world where the Nielsen rating of a specific Thursday at 8 o'clock determined whether something lived or died. It exists now in a world of streaming and fragmentation, and social media virality, and YouTube compilations and TikTok clips, and on-demand viewing and global distribution that reaches people in places the original Fox broadcast never touched. It has found audiences in each of these new landscapes. The clips circulate. The characters remain cultural touchstones. The theme music is still recognizable to hundreds of millions of people. Most shows do not make it to Season 5. Family Guy is under contract through Season 27. The 30th anniversary is on the horizon, and somewhere in that fictional Rhode Island town on the coast of the smallest state in the Union, that place that has existed in the collective imagination of its viewers for a quarter century, the Griffins are still going. Peter is still falling down and getting back up again with the undiminished enthusiasm of someone for whom each fall is the first fall. Lois is still the eye at the center of the storm. The person whose capacity for patience is not unlimited but whose love is. Brian is still at the bar, Still nursing the martini? Still carrying the manuscript that has been not quite finished for 25 years? Still the character who contains more human truth than he always gets credit for. Stewie is still building things he should not build, still speaking in that extraordinary voice, still somewhere under the emotional layers that 2 decades of character development have accumulated the baby genius who looked at the world in season 1 and decided it was not living up to his expectations and something would have to be done about that. And Meg Griffin is still there. Still navigating the household with the particular resilience of someone who has been underestimated and overlooked and occasionally genuinely hurt and has come through it without becoming small or cruel or broken. In the later seasons, the show has started to give her what she always deserved. Episodes where she is the capable one, the interesting one, the one whose perspective is worth spending time with. It is late, but it is happening. And there is something right about that, about a character who spent so long being dismissed by the story that contained her finally being allowed to be seen. That is the story. All 461 episodes of it, across 24 seasons, stretching from January 1999 to May 2026, and continuing forward. All the chicken fights and the road to adventures and the cutaway gags and the original songs. All the moments that made you laugh unexpectedly at 11 at night. All the moments that made you uncomfortable. All the moments, the genuine, surprising, completely unearned, and therefore completely earned moments that made you feel something real in the middle of what you were told was just a cartoon. The story of Family Guy is the story of something that endured, something that was killed twice and came back, something that was loved so passionately that its audience bought millions of DVDs to resurrect it, something that peaked brilliantly and then struggled and then found a kind of sustainable middle ground and then slowly, imperfectly, with many steps backward for every step forward, began to find its way back towards some version of what it had originally been. That is the entire story of Family Guy. It is still being written. The Griffins are still out there. Stewie's spin-off is coming. The 30th anniversary is on the horizon. Sleep well, you have earned it. Because here is the thing about the story we just told. The thing that does not fit neatly into any particular section and so belongs at the end, in the quiet. Family Guy mattered, past tense and present tense both, in different ways, for different reasons. In 1999, it mattered because it was genuinely new. The speed of its humor, the willingness to cut sideways at any moment, the specific combination of pop culture awareness and sentimental core that made it unlike anything else on the Sunday night schedule. It created a template for a kind of animated comedy that a great many shows would try to replicate in the years that followed, and most of them would miss something essential that the original had. They would get the cutaway format but not the warmth underneath it. They would get the irreverence but not the craft. In 2001, it mattered because Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows proved that an animated sitcom could win an Emmy for a song about love and mortality and mean it. It proved that the genre was not constrained to easy comedy, that the medium could hold genuine feeling without collapsing into parody or losing its comic credibility. The combination of a talking dog, a dying woman, and a song that was genuinely beautiful demonstrated something about what animation could do that live-action television sometimes struggled to do. It could find the heart inside the absurd without either diminishing the absurdity or cheapening the heart. In 2003, it mattered because it showed an industry something it needed to know. A show that had been canceled twice, that had been written off as commercially worthless, was beloved enough that its audience would go looking for it, would buy physical copies of it. I would watch it at midnight on cable just to see it again. The industry learned from this. The lesson it drew was complicated and not always correctly applied, but the core insight that an audience can love a show more deeply than the traditional metrics reveal was true and remains true. In 2025, Family Guy matters because it is still there, still recognizable, still capable, on its best days, of doing what it has always done at its finest, finding the comedy that exists in the specific temperature of American family life, the particular friction between what people mean and what they do, between what they love and how badly they sometimes express it. That comedy has not aged out. It will not age out. As long as there are families that are dysfunctional and loving in equal measure, which is to say, as long as there are families at all, there will be something true at the heart of what the Griffins represent. The story of Family Guy is not a simple story of triumph or decline. It is the story of something alive, flawed and extraordinary and improbable, and sometimes frustrating and sometimes magnificent, moving through 25 years of American life and emerging at the other end still. Recognizably itself. That is not nothing. That is in fact quite a lot. Now sleep. The Griffins will be there in the morning. And if you wake up and find yourself wanting to go back to the beginning, wanting to watch Death Has a Shadow, or A Hero Sits Next Door, or Brian Wallows and Peter Swallows, or Road to Europe, or any of those first 29 episodes that started everything, do it. Go back. The early seasons of Family Guy reward revisiting in a way that many long-running shows do not, because they were made by people who were working at the top of their ability on material they genuinely cared about. That quality does not age. It does not become less true as the seasons accumulate around it. Whatever the show became in the years that followed, and it became many things, some of them wonderful and some of them frustrating, it started as something genuinely special. A kid from Connecticut with an 8mm camera and a student film and a dream of working in animation built something that changed the rules of what a canceled show means. That changed the rules of what a television family can be, that gave millions of people hundreds of hours of company across a quarter-century of their lives. The Griffins were there on Sunday nights and then on Wednesday nights and on Adult Swim and on Hulu and in clip compilations and on merchandise and in the cultural air that animated comedy breathes. They were always there. They still are. Good night.